Call of Cthulhu: Destiny's End. Call of Cthulhu is a 1928 short story written by H.P. Lovecraft, who is best known for creating the Cthulhu mythos. If you don't know what Cthulhu is, it's basically a mythical sea creature that is immensely powerful and is described as a cosmic being. Anyway, Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos would go on to gain some prominence in the horror and mythology communities, with Cthulhu still remaining a popular figure today. That popularity will even find itself in the gaming community, as a Call of Cthulhu board game was released in 1981, which would go on to have a strong cult following that still exists today. In fact, following the inspirations of the board game in Lovecraft's work, the first Call of Cthulhu video game would be released, titled Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth. The game would be developed by Headfirst Productions and published by Bethesda, with the game doing a good job of using survival horror elements to help visualize the mystery and horror of Lovecraft's works. In fact, Headfirst had big plans to develop the Call of Cthulhu trilogy, with Destiny's End and Beyond the Mountains of Madness following up from Dark Corners of the Earth. However, both of these games would eventually get cancelled due to Headfirst failing to find a publisher for both games, which would also lead to them eventually going bankrupt. Not much is known about the games besides their premises, as Destiny's End would focus on two characters named Emily and Jacob, searching for clues about their past in Innsmouth, Massachusetts, which would include solving puzzles and fighting mythos creatures. Destiny's End would have also been unique for a survival horror game, as it would have included a two-player co-op mode. As for Beyond the Mountains of Madness, it would focus on globe-trotting archaeologists exploring many locations and shooting mythos monsters, being very similar to Indiana Jones. Despite those cancellations, Call of Cthulhu still continues to have an impact in the video game community, as a 2018 game developed by Cyanide and published by Focus Home Interactive would release. Fallout Van Buren. Fallout Van Buren was originally supposed to be the third installment in the original Fallout series that was developed by Black Isle Studios and published by Interplay Entertainment. Van Buren's development started in 1998 and was planned to be the first 3D game in the Fallout series. It would have been based in the Southwest US region, as you played as an escaped prisoner trying to escape and hide from a mad scientist. However, similar to Earthbound 64, Black Isle had very little experience with 3D graphics. This would lead to them financially struggling and Interplay ultimately cancelling the game, with the development team moving on to help make Icewind Dale. In 2003, Interplay's financial situation would only get worse, as video game development would become more expensive and the industry shifting to home consoles. They would even lose rights to release Dungeons & Dragons games on computers, which led to the cancellation of Baldur's Gate 3: The Black Hound. Shortly after the game's cancellation, Chris Avellone, the top designer for Fallout 2, would resign from Black Isle and Interplay, saying that Interplay's vision has changed and they could not see them recover from their struggles. Baldur's Gate 3's cancellation would result in Interplay and Black Isle using the assets to try and make Van Buren again, with Josh Sawyer taking Avalon's spot as lead designer. Sawyer wanted Interplay's feedback on the game during the development process. However, Interplay would not give any response, as if they didn't care about the game. They would even remove a member from the Van Buren team, causing Sawyer to resign. Tim Kaine, the creator of Fallout, would eventually play the Van Buren beta, saying they'll take at least 18 months to complete. Interplay, with a 6-month timeline instead, would ultimately decide to cancel Van Buren for financial reasons. Interplay would also lay off all of Black Isle's staff and would focus on a console release for Fallout, releasing Brotherhood of Steel in 2004. That would be the last Fallout game under Interplay, as Bethesda would purchase the intellectual property in 2007. Bethesda would quickly release Fallout 3 in 2008 and Fallout New Vegas in 2010, with both of these games receiving high acclaim and being known as some of the best games in the late 2000s. In fact, New Vegas would actually use some assets from the original Van Buren, like taking place in the Southwest. New Vegas was also developed by Obsidian Entertainment, which was co-founded by Avalon along with other Black Isle employees. There are attempts by fans today at trying to create a true Fallout Van Buren game, thanks in large part to a demo being leaked in 2007, along with a massive 700-page design document for the game, with major strides being made through fan games and mods of Fallout 2 and New Vegas. Metal Arms 2. Metal Arms is a 2003 game that was published by Vivendi Games and developed by a new company called Swingin' Ape Studios. The game would be about a robot named Glitch who fights evil robots to protect his planet Ironstar from being conquered. As for the gameplay, it's a third-person shooter that also has some action and exploration sections. Metal Arms would go on to receive positive ratings and even be nominated by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Science for Console Game of the Year. For Swingin' Ape's first game, that's not too shabby. Swingin' Ape would try to follow up on that success by making Metal Arms 2. However, as I mentioned in my StarCraft Ghost entry, Blizzard would ultimately go on to buy Swingin' Ape Studios in 2005, along with the rights to Metal Arms. Any plans for Metal Arms 2 would be cancelled, and Blizzard has no plans of reviving the series as of this moment, so Metal Arms is not only the first, but it's also the only game Swingin' Ape Studios ever developed. South Park Open World Game. This entry refers to a 2005 game that was being developed by both Ubisoft and BuzzMonkey Software. The game would have been heavily inspired by GTA and The Simpsons Hit and Run, as you explore the town of South Park and cause mayhem while completing missions. However, the game will ultimately be cancelled due to harsh treatment of BuzzMonkey's developers by two producers who had never produced before. They would be described as being extremely aggressive to the developers, as well as just acting weird in general. Ubisoft will ultimately cancel the game and also fire the two producers. There are other factors that led to the game's cancellation, like the producers pushing unreasonable deadlines, as well as the developers being very inexperienced, which all combined into one chaotic mess. A prototype version of the game will be discovered in 2015, but besides the gameplay, not much else is known about the game, except for the first mission, which is similar to the episode Up but Down Steroid, as Corbin would pretend to be disabled so he can participate in the Special Olympics. With South Park being as big as it is, there have been many other games to be developed, like the highly acclaimed Stick of Truth, but a game that is similar to the cancelled 2005 game still doesn't exist. Obsidian Aliens. Aliens Crucible, also referred to as Obsidian Aliens, would have been a third-person RPG set in the Aliens universe, a first for the series. The game was being developed by Obsidian Entertainment, who I mentioned previously in my Fallout entry, as well as being published by Sega. Development for the game would start around late 2006, however, when Sega announced Aliens vs Predators in February 2009, they will also announce that development for Aliens Crucible has been suspended indefinitely. While the reason for the suspension was never given, there were reports of employees at Obsidian losing their jobs, which would affect the development process. It was also reported that Obsidian had trouble marketing the game to Sega executives. They also had doubts that the Aliens universe would be suitable for an RPG. But despite that, Obsidian claimed that the game was almost finished. However, the British game studio, Creative Assembly, would forcefully pitch Sega their idea for an Aliens game. Sega will ultimately side with Creative Assembly and cancel Obsidian's game in June 2009. Creative Assembly's game would eventually release in 2014, be the highly acclaimed Aliens Isolation. As for Aliens Crucible, I think Chris Avellone described the concept of the game best, as being like Mass Effect but with horror elements. It would have also been very unique for an RPG at the time, due to its darker setting and characters who would permanently die. While it's a shame that Aliens Crucible was cancelled, it also makes sense, as Aliens Isolation was likely to be more successful. But still, Obsidian would go on to make classics of their own, like Fallout New Vegas and The Stick of Truth, so both sides benefited at the end. Super Mario's Wacky Worlds. Super Mario's Wacky Worlds was a game that was being developed by Nova Logic for the Philips CGI. You might be curious as to why a Mario game would be made for a system that wasn't associated with Nintendo. Well, at the time, Philips was helping Nintendo build a CD-ROM add-on for the SNES that would never officially release. However, Nintendo would give Philips the rights to use Nintendo characters for their CDI system. They would make games like Hotel Mario and 3 Zelda games, but these games would be considered the worst games in their respective franchises, with many clips of the games becoming popular memes due to how poor and cheesy they are. Anyway, Super Mario's Wacky Worlds would have been one of those games. Nova Logic wanted to impress Nintendo in the hopes of getting hired by them to develop exclusive games. A Nintendo sales executive would suggest that a simplified style of the SNES graphics could work on the CGI, so Nova Logic decided to make a sequel to Super Mario World. Super Mario's Wacky Worlds would pretty much be similar to the original Super Mario World. However, the backgrounds would be inspired by real-life places, and the enemies would also be dressed based on the location's culture. Developers Silas Warner and John Brooks would work for nearly 24 hours a day for 2 weeks on the game, with them only finishing one part of the level to show to Nintendo. Nintendo would be impressed by what they saw, however, due to the poor sales of the CDI, the game would be cancelled. Super Mario's Wacky Worlds had 3 prototypes that were leaked to the public, with the best one being nearly 30% completion of the game, but there are obviously some glitches and flaws, like enemies being unable to hurt Mario. Today, many people see Wacky World's cancellation as a good thing, since it would have tainted Super Mario World's legacy, and it will most likely become a laughingstock like the other Nintendo CDI games. As for the employees at Nova Logic, many will go on to work at more successful companies like EA, so at least that's a good ending. Shadow of the Eternals. Shadow of the Eternals was supposed to be a follow-up to Silicon Knights' 2002 GameCube classic, Eternal Darkness, which is praised for being a very unique horror game as it takes place across 4 timelines, as well as using Lovecraft horror elements. That's of course not mentioning its iconic Sandy meter as well. Anyway, the game's director, as well as Silicon Knights founder Dennis Dyack, has been wanting to make a follow-up to Eternal Darkness for a while. In fact, there were major plans in 2011 to make an Eternal Darkness sequel for the Wii U, as Nintendo would trademark the property. However, the project was eventually cancelled due to Silicon Knights' legal troubles with Epic Games at the time. In fact, Silicon Knights' legal battle would ultimately lead to the company going bankrupt and shutting down in 2013. This would lead to another gaming company, Precursor Games, to hire many of the recently laid off Silicon Knights staff. They would then go on to make a $1.5 million crowdfunding campaign to create a spiritual spin-off to Eternal Darkness titled Shadow of the Eternals. That same month, another crowdfunding campaign on Kickstarter would be created, looking for $1.35 million. Both of these campaigns would be cancelled halfway through, however, as both failed to even pass 200,000. Precursor Games would promise to create a better fundraiser and fan experience. However, in June of 2013, Precursor Games founding member and co-designer for Eternal Darkness, Kenneth McAloch, will get arrested and plead guilty to child pornography charges. The studio would immediately cut all ties from him and would launch another Kickstarter for $750,000, significantly cutting down the original planned scope of the game. But the damage to the game's image was already done, and in September 2013, Shadow of the Eternals would be delayed indefinitely, as it failed to reach its goal. A year later, Dyack will create a new company called Quantum Entanglement Entertainment. He will restart Shadow of the Eternals' development and even considered making it a film or television series. However, Dyack will quietly shut down the company in 2018, and Shadow of the Eternals would finally be cancelled. Dyack will rename the company to Apocalypse Studio and announce the development of a new RPG called Dead House Sonata, which is still in development as of this video. The game is supposed to be a spiritual successor to Dyack's 1996 game, Blood Omen Legacy of Kain. However, Dyack also clarified that would include aspects from multiple games he made, including the Lovecraftian overtones from Eternal Darkness. Shadow the Eternals probably has the craziest story of a cancelled game that I talked about so far, as it came with multiple failures, controversies, and a company bankruptcy. But I am curious about what Dyack will do in the future, as well as the future of the Eternal Darkness series. Scrapped Conker Games. Conker is a gaming series that was created by Rare. He would make his debut in Diddy Kong Racing, but his first solo game was Conker's Pocket Tales for the Game Boy Color, which would receive mediocre reviews, but would still be praised for pushing the color's limits. However, the 2001 release of Conker's Bad Fur Day for the N64 would become an instant classic and put Conker's name on the map. This was due to the game's dramatic shift from Pocket Tales, as Conker's Bad Fur Day was rated M due to the game's violence, language, and heavy sexual theme, which offered a very unique gaming experience at the time, especially on a Nintendo console. Conker would receive another game in 2005 titled Conker Live and Reloaded, which would also receive positive reviews. However, besides those two games, the rest of Conker's discography is very controversial to say the least. But this entry is not about Conker's discography, but instead his two cancelled games, the first of which is 12 Tales Conker 64, which would have released on the Nintendo 64. Originally, the game would be announced as Conker's Quest at E3 '97, and would have been rated E like Conker's Pocket Tales. It would have been very similar to Banjo-Kazooie, as Conker and Bay would have to collect over 100 presents scattered by the hoodlums. However, Rare would start to get criticism as they already made similar games such as Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64, with fans saying that Rare can only make innocent platformers with cute animals. But developers would take offense to that, and Rare announced that they would redesign the game to make it more mature. This resulted in Conker's Bad Fur Day, and as I mentioned before, the game would be praised for its more mature nature, justifying its redesign. The second cancelled Conker game would be Conker's Other Bad Day, which was intended to be a follow-up to Bad Fur Day and released on the GameCube. However, with Microsoft buying Rare in 2002, it changed the plans. For some reason, Microsoft didn't really like Conker's Other Bad Day, so Rare would rework it and it eventually became Conker Live and Reloaded. Which is a shame since Conker's Other Bad Day would have had a really interesting plot, as it would have focused on Conker looking for Barry, while also being a kink and wasting his money on beer and hookers. Barry would have also been a Terminator-like character, which is pretty cool. Even though these games never released, Conker will still have a very successful discography, for better or for worse, going down as a very memorable animal mascot in the early 2000s, similar to Banjo-Kazooie. Virtual Boy Games. The Virtual Boy is a 1995 portable gaming system released by Nintendo. It was intended to continue Nintendo's dominance in the portable system market, as well as pushing the future of gaming by creating the first major system that uses virtual reality gameplay. However, the Virtual Boy had several major problems, with the biggest being its design, as the system's headset is extremely bulky, which made it hard to be played in public settings. The system also didn't have a head strap, and instead came with a stand, so it could only play on a flat surface, which further restricted its portability. Finally, the Virtual Boy games only had two colors, being red and black. This made playing games really hard, as the graphics caused players to receive headaches and even seizures after playing a game for a while. Not to mention that most of the games failed to give the players a virtual reality experience, which was the system's main selling point. The system was also very pricey, as it was priced at $180 in the US, which is equivalent to around $370 today. Due to all of these factors, the Virtual Boy would receive negative reviews across the board, and would only be in circulation around a year before being discontinued. The system will only sell around 700,000 copies in its lifetime, going down as Nintendo's biggest failure. Despite the Virtual Boy's flaws, however, Nintendo still had high hopes for the system, as they promoted many games that they planned to release, which include entries like Mario Bros, Mario Kart, Star Fox, Bomberman, Street Fighter 2, Donkey Kong Country 2, and even GoldenEye 007. However, as the Virtual Boy failed, these games would also be cancelled, with some of them going on to be developed for other systems. There are many other interesting games cancelled for the Virtual Boy listed on a Wikipedia article, so if you want more information about them, I'll leave a link in the description. Legend of Zelda: Mystical Seed of Courage. Mystical Seed of Courage was originally supposed to be the sequel to the Game Boy Color titles Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. It was set to release months after the release of the previous two games. However, the game will ultimately be cancelled as the developer had problems connecting the three games together. The only thing known about the Mystical Seed of Courage was that Pharaoh was going to be the Oracle, similar to Din's and Nehru's roles in both Seasons and Ages respectively. The game was also supposed to focus on time travel puzzles involving the time of day, and Oracle of Ages was originally going to focus on color-based puzzles. However, after the Mystical Seed of Courage was cancelled, the time travel theme would be transferred to Ages instead. Fire Emblem 64. These next few entries will be about major titles that were supposed to get entries for the N64, but for one reason or another would end up getting cancelled. This entry will focus on the Fire Emblem series. Fire Emblem is one of Nintendo's more interesting series, as it was originally a Japanese exclusive series during the 80s and 90s. However, thanks to the Smash Bros. Series, Fire Emblem would start to get more attention than the rest, and has become a major growing franchise for Nintendo. Anyway, Fire Emblem 64, also known as Maiden of Madness, was originally planned for the 64DD. It would be announced by Shigeru Miyamoto in 1997, saying that the game would release after Super Mario RPG 2 in the later part of the year. Super Mario RPG 2 would eventually become Paper Mario. Problems would arise, however, as the 64DD would end up failing, and development would shift to the base N64. Fire Emblem's creator, Shuzu Kaga, would also leave Intelligent Systems and Nintendo shortly after the release of Thracia 776. Kaga would make his own gaming company called Turnanog, where he would develop a title for the Sony PlayStation, which made matters worse for the Fire Emblem series and Nintendo. Shortly after Kaga's departure, Fire Emblem 64 would be cancelled. The project would eventually be reworked as The Binding Blade, which was released on the GBA in 2002. Most of the original game's assets were removed, with only the characters of War and Corel being carried over. Besides that though, not much is known about Fire Emblem 64, except for one photo from the game that will be included in Fire Emblem's 25th anniversary book. Final Fantasy 64. Final Fantasy is one of the best gaming series of all time, as it does a great job of creating a unique battle system, as well as telling rich stories with memorable characters, being a huge influence in the RPG genre. During Nintendo's early years, they had a strong partnership with Squaresoft, known today as Square Enix, which resulted in them creating the first 6 Final Fantasy games for the NES and SNES, as well as other memorable titles like Chrono Trigger and Super Mario RPG. In 1995, with the debut of the PlayStation and the emergence of 3D gaming, Squaresoft had a lot of decisions to make when it came to the future of the Final Fantasy franchise. With their past commitments to Nintendo, Squaresoft decided to make a Final Fantasy demo for the N64. Being called Final Fantasy VI, the interactive CG game, or simply Final Fantasy 64, the demo would showcase the characters from Final Fantasy III in a 3D environment, while also showcasing a revamped battle system as well as camera angles. However, Squaresoft eventually decided to release Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation instead, while also using a lot of the assets from the N64 demo. This was due to the PlayStation's CD-ROM being able to hold more data than the N64's ROM cartridge, as well as Squaresoft being dissatisfied with Nintendo's strict content standards. This would end up being the right decision, as Final Fantasy VII would become the second best-selling game on the PlayStation, as well as the best game in the Final Fantasy series, with it being praised for its compelling story and large scope, something that the N64 couldn't reproduce. GTA 64. Grand Theft Auto is a series that needs very little introduction. It became a staple in gaming thanks in large part to the success of GTA 3, which introduced the series to 3D and was loved due to its fun and innovative gameplay. Vice City and San Andreas would also become classics during the 2000s, but are still loved and enjoyed today. GTA 5 would also become the second best-selling game of all time, and the upcoming release of GTA 6 will most likely continue GTA's success. However, the GTA series has very humble beginnings, as it was originally a 2D game that would only sell over 1 million copies on the PlayStation, Windows, and weirdly enough, the Game Boy Color. There was even an N64 port for GTA planned that would have included enhanced graphics and more levels. However, the port will end up getting cancelled for unknown reasons. In fact, many thought GTA 64 was only a rumor. That was until a scan from the N64 magazine confirmed its existence. However, no footage from the game has ever been released. Insane. Insane was supposed to be the start of a horror game trilogy series that would have been directed by Guillermo del Toro, who I mentioned in my Silent Hills entry. The trilogy will be announced at the 2010 Spike Video Game Awards, with it being developed by Volition and published by THQ. It was intended to release on the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Windows, with the first game expected to be released in 2013. However, THQ would cancel the project in August 2012, and the intellectual property would be transferred back to Del Toro. While the reason for the game's cancellation was never revealed, THQ would file for bankruptcy 5 months later, which was likely the major reason for its cancellation. It's still possible that Del Toro could use the Insane property for another video game attempt or film project. However, with there being no updates in over a decade, the ideal is becoming less likely. Sadness. Sadness was a survival horror game that was being developed by the Polish game studio Nibris. The game would be announced in 2006, as well as also being an exclusive for the Wii, with it actually being one of the first titles announced for the system. The game would have been unique since it was supposed to have black and white graphics along with a Victorian era aesthetic. It would have also focused on psychological horror, focusing on issues like narcolepsy, nyctophobia, and schizophrenia. As for the game's story, it would have taken place before World War I in the Russian Empire, in what is modern-day Ukraine, focusing on the character of Maria Liniel, a Polish-Hungarian aristocrat, and her son Alexander, as they try to survive after their train to Lviv derails in the countryside. Enemies will include Slavic mythology creatures like the werewolf and Liko. The Wii's motion controls would have allowed players to interact with items as well as using and creating weapons. The game was also supposed to have a branching story that resulted in 10 different endings. Anyway, Nibris would partner with Frontline Studios and Digital Amigos to help with the game's programming and visuals, with the goal of releasing the game by late 2007. However, during that time, no trailers, demos, or even screenshots were released. Many gaming websites and blogs start considering Sadness as vaporware, since Frontline will leave the project citing artistic differences. This would cause the game to be pushed back to 2009 release. In 2009, in Europe would interview former Nibris employee Adam Antolsky. He would state that prolonged disputes by Nibris and Frontline over the game's design led to its failure to meet deadlines. Antolsky would state that the only progress Nibris made in the first year was a completed script, concept designs, and a 3D model of a minecart. He would also state that Nibris was better at promoting than actually making anything. Which rang true, as Nibris would fail at making an appearance at E3 2009, or releasing the game that year. In February 2010, Nibris' official website would close down. Finally, in April 2010, one of Sadness' music composers, Arkadiusz Rykoski, released some of the game's music to the public, before finally announcing that Nibris has given up development on Sadness. In October of that year, Nibris would become a coordinator for the European Center of Games. giving up game development permanently. Aristodabras' staff and projects would be transferred to Bloober Team, who is best known for Layers of Fear and the Silent Hill 2 remake. Lost ZX Spectrum prototypes. The ZX Spectrum was an early 1980s computer that became one of the first gaming computers accessible to the public, along with its competitor, the Commodore 64. The Spectrum is also one of the most influential systems of all time, since it made computers easily accessible in the UK, as well as being a pivotal step in computer gaming. It was the introduction to developers Tim and Chris Stamper, who made games like Attic Attack and Jetpack for the Spectrum. They were originally created by company Rare, which became a powerhouse for Nintendo in the 90s. With the Spectrum being as old as it is, it's no surprise that several of the system's games have become lost, due to few copies of the game being created. There are several lost games, but the most prominent ones are Quake-1, 3D Slime, Frank the Flea, and the Bobby Yaz Show. Today, there is a dedicated group that plans on finding and archiving many of the lost games, with strong progress being made throughout the years. Anyway, if you're curious about the lost Spectrum games, I'll leave a link in the description. Kurayami. Kurayami was an action-adventure game that was pitched to be a PS3 exclusive. The game was pitched by Goichi Suda, also known as Suda51, who is best known for games like No More Heroes and Lollipop Chainsaw. The game was also supposed to be produced by Shinji Mikami, who is best known for directing several Resident Evil games. As for the game itself, it would have been inspired by Franz Kafka's novel The Castle, with the game focusing on a character named G, traveling throughout a European village, trying to reach a castle and fight enemies by using light. The game would be pitched to EA, and they would actually express interest in the title. However, with EA not liking Suda's vision for the game, they would ultimately decide to back out and cancel the project. Even though Kurayami was cancelled, it will still have a legacy thanks to its unique style and idea. In fact, Kurayami's concepts would go on to inspire Suda51's later works. Kurayami would also see a manga release called Kurayami Dance. City of the Dead. City of the Dead was a 2004 game that was being developed by Kuju Entertainment, with Hemp Interactive being the publisher. The game would have been a typical zombie FPS game, as you try to survive a zombie outbreak on an island. The game was also going to be connected to George A. Romero's Living Dead series, which is best known for classical movies like Night of the Living Dead, as well as the Dead Rising video game series. Anyway, City of the Dead was expected to release in 2006 for the PS2, Xbox, and PC. It would also receive a trailer, and gameplay would even be shown at E3 2005. However, after the game's E3 appearance, no new information would come out from the game, as it would eventually be cancelled. While no statement was made as to why the game was cancelled, it most likely was due to Hip Interactive going bankrupt in July 2005. Dead Rising would come out a year later, so not much of a loss in the grand scheme of things. Dead Phoenix. Dead Phoenix is a game that was supposed to be developed by Capcom. It was also supposed to be part of Capcom 5. If you haven't heard of Capcom 5 before, it was basically a plan that was announced in 2002 to release 5 exclusive games for the GameCube. The goal of the project was to highlight Capcom's third-party support, as well as helping Nintendo to boost sales for the GameCube, which was struggling against the Xbox and PS2 at the time. Besides Dead Phoenix, the other games in Capcom 5 included P&O 3, Beautiful Joe, Killer 7, and Resident Evil 4. These games would have a unique gameplay style from one another. P&O 3 will be a futuristic third-person shooter, Beautiful Joe will be a side-scrolling action platformer. Resident Evil 4 will be similar to its earlier entries as a third-person shooter horror game. Finally, Killer 7 will be an action-adventure game with first-person shooter gameplay. As for Dead Phoenix, it was going to be a 3D shoot-'em-up as you'd play as a ringed man named Phoenix who would fly around and shoot massive enemies. The gameplay was compared to Sega's Panzer Dragon, as well as having elements similar to Nintendo's Kid Icarus. However, the game will ultimately be cancelled in 2003, as it failed to appear at E3 and was removed from Capcom's website. The reason for the game's cancellation was mainly due to the poor sales of the GameCube, as the Capcom 5 project failed at increasing fan interest in the system. Capcom would also shift their priorities and would focus on multi-platform releases. In fact, besides P&L 3, the other Capcom 5 games would eventually see releases on the PS2 and Windows. While the Capcom 5 project failed at its main objective, most of the games would be viewed very highly, as Resident Evil 4 is considered one of the best games in the series, and P&L 3 and Killer 7 would become cult classics. Kodoku. Kodoku was a game that was being developed by Carnival Studio in 2014 for PS4, PS Vita, and PC. The game would have been highly influenced by classic Japanese horror films, as it would have been a survival horror game that focused on a lone protagonist battling yokai and exploring a cursed island. However, the game will ultimately be cancelled due to financial and funding issues. There was an attempt in 2016 to revive the game, being called Kodoku 3D, but again, this project would also be quickly cancelled for similar reasons. Besides the game's summary and a few teaser trailers and screenshots, not much else is known about the game. Return to Ravenholm. Half-Life Ravenholm, also referred to as Return to Ravenholm, was supposed to be a spin-off game of Half-Life 2, which was being developed by Arcane Studios in 2006. The game would have been unique from the Half-Life series by focusing on the horror elements of the game, as you play as Adrian Shepard tried to survive a zombie outbreak in Ravenholm. Despite the game's potential, Valve would eventually cancel the project a year later in 2007. While the reason for the game's cancellation was never stated, it's believed that Valve didn't really like the headcrab zombies being replaced by regular zombies. They also thought the game didn't really stand out from other zombie FPS at the time, and wanted to focus on something more creative. Thanks to fans' interest in the project, more information about Return to Ravenholm has been revealed throughout the years, with the biggest reveal coming in 2022, as gameplay footage of the game was uploaded to YouTube. Demonic. Demonic is a game that has a really interesting story. The project was originally planned by Clive Barker, who is best known for the Hellraiser series. The game was expected to release first, along with a potential movie adaptation in the future. As for Demonic's plot, the game would have focused on a powerful demon named Volrath. He would originally be summoned by humans and help them seek their vengeance. However, Volrath would eventually get stronger after every summoning, eventually becoming free and planning to conquer the world. The players will have to battle humans and supernatural enemies to help Volrath complete his mission. Demonic would be showcased at E3 2005. However, despite the project's connections and promise, the game would eventually get cancelled in 2006. The main reason for the game's cancellation was due to the publisher, Majesco Entertainment, having financial difficulties. Despite the game's cancellation, Demonic would still have a legacy, as the game would be featured in the 2006 stoner comedy film Grandma's Boy. Diddy Kong Pilot. Diddy Kong Pilot was supposed to be the sequel to the N64 classic Diddy Kong Racing. The game would be developed for the GBA, and as the title suggests, would focus on the flying elements in Diddy Kong Racing. The characters would also focus more on the Donkey Kong universe, as DK, Dixie Kong, and King K. Rool was supposed to be playable. However, for unknown reasons, Diddy Kong Pilot would be cancelled and be replaced by Banjo Pilot instead. There was very little information about the game. That was until 2011, when a channel named Transparentenjo, who was also a former Rare employee, would post gameplay footage of a 2003 version of Diddy Kong Pilot. Today, that version is easily accessible through ROMs, and while not complete, people can get to play and learn about the cancelled Diddy Kong Racing sequel. Pokemon 2024 leaks. The Pokemon 2024 leaks are an extension to the Nintendo Giga leaks I talked about earlier. However, these leaks are more specific to the Pokemon series. I already talked about the Diamond and Pearl prototypes as well as the Pokemon MMO, so let's get to the new leaks. There were unused designs for Pokemon that leaked. For example, there was a Pokemon design that was based on a peanut, however, little information is known about it. There was also a poison-type chameleon that was planned for Pokemon X and Y, that was again scrapped for unknown reasons. Speaking of X and Y, there were alternative designs for Pokemon, with an example being a beta of Mega Charizard Y. There are also some Pokemon designs that would appear in future games, like a Flamingo Pokemon that would eventually become Flamigo in Generation 9. There were also ideas for unique Pokemon evolutions, like having a Pokemon evolved or change colors after training it in a specific country, or having a Pokemon evolve after releasing it into the wild. However, these ideas were likely scrapped due to how convoluted they were. For the upcoming Pokemon Legends ZA, there have been leaks of new Mega Evolutions. That includes Pokemon like Zygarde, Zorora, Greninja, Delphox, Chestnut, Xerneas, and Yveltal. However, none of these evolutions have been confirmed as of this video. There's also cancelled Pokemon games as well, like Pokemon Rodeo, which was supposed to be a battle royale described as being a combination of Pokemon Stadium and Splatoon. However, this project was cancelled after the mainline Pokemon games were transferred to home consoles. Another game with a working title called Project Swallow was supposed to be like WarioWare, but with Pokemon. One of the minigames would involve players tilting a device to connect 3 Magnemites into a Magneton. This game was eventually cancelled due to monetization concerns and the poor success of other Pokemon mobile games, excluding Pokemon Go. Finally, there was a small minigame plan that consisted of Rhyhorns racing, but was cancelled for unknown reasons. Information about Generation 10 would also release. The region of Generation 10 is supposedly called Gaia, and is inspired by Greece's Cyclades Islands. Gen 10 will focus heavily on ancient Greek mythology, and Pokemon like Aaron, Charjabug, and Butterfree are expected to return. However, these claims are still unconfirmed. Unreleased Pokemon lore would also leak, as well as bring some major controversy to the series, since it confirmed that humans and Pokemon have had sexual relationships. The most prominent story was about a girl getting lost in the mountains and being saved by Typhlosion. They would eventually live in a cave together and even have a kid somehow. There are other stories, like a man's relationship with Octillery, but the less said about them, the better. Finally, updates about future Pokemon trading cards, anime, and movie projects were revealed. More specifically, a Mega Evolution card set is planned for September 2025. As for anime, there are potential plans to incorporate Legends ZA into the latest series, which could possibly explore Zygarde's lore and potential Mega Evolution. Information about the upcoming Detective Pikachu film was also leaked. There are some other leaks, like source codes and concept art, but I just stuck to what I thought was the most important and interesting information. Airworld. Airworld was originally supposed to be part of the Sword Crest quadrilogy series on the Atari Train 600. The series of games would focus on a pair of twins named Tora and Tor, who travel to different worlds and collect many treasures to get the Sword of Ultimate Sorcery to avenge their parents' death at the hands of King Tyrannus. Each of the Sword Crest games is named after the 4 main elements, being Earthworld, Fireworld, Waterworld, and Airworld. Each game will have a specific theme, with Earthworld focusing on the zodiac signs, Fireworld the Kabbalah Tree of Life, Waterworld on chakras, and Airworld on the Yi Jing. Sword Quest will be one of the first major attempts to add narrative and puzzle solving in the action-adventure genre. The series will also see heavy advertising from Atari, as the Sword Quest comic series will be created in partnership with DC Comics. Atari would also hold a contest for the game, where they gave out some pretty nice prizes. I won't go into too much detail, since the prizes have a very interesting story that I might make a video about later, but I'll leave an image just to show you how extravagant they were. With hearing how much attention the Sword Crest series got, You might be curious as to why the game was cancelled. Well, Swordcrest was made during the infamous 1983 video game crash, which saw Atari sales drastically plummet. Not to mention the fact that Atari was also dealing with an insider trading scandal from former CEO Ray Krasser. Atari would eventually hire James Morgan as the new CEO, who would then quickly cancel Airworld and the Swordcrest contest to save money. In 2022, Atari would collaborate with Digital Eclipse to create a 50th anniversary collection special. In that collection, Digital Eclipse would finally release Airworld nearly 40 years after its cancellation. While it's not the exact same game, Digital Eclipse still made Airworld as close to the original as possible, satisfying most fans and put Airworld in the same company as Star Fox 2 and Metroid Dread, as games who had to wait years before finally being released. Prospero was one of the first games Valve designed. The game was going to be an action-adventure title, focusing on a character named Aleph who fights using her psionic abilities. The game would have been highly influenced by the 90s classic Myst. During that same time, Valve would also start development on Half-Life, which took over some of Prospero's assets. In response, Prospero would transition to be an MMO that would have allowed players to make their own worlds and access other people's as well through an in-game library. However, shortly after Half-Life's release, little news about Prospero would come out, with many presuming the game has been cancelled. The main reason for Prospero's cancellation was due to Half-Life, as it would become Valve's top priority at the time. Half-Life would also incorporate many of Prospero's gimmicks, including a friend finder and user-created content, which will help Half-Life become one of the most influential games of all time, and help create the modern landscape for Valve and Steam. Despite Prospero's cancellation, Valve has continued to tease the project, with Valve co-founder Gabe Newell saying in 2006 that he'd like to resume Prospero after Team Fortress 2 was released, as well as another teaser in 2020 during a Reddit AMA. So while I wouldn't completely rule out an eventual Prospero release, I will still say that's highly unlikely due to Valve's history of releasing highly requested games. Flesh and Wire. Flesh and Wire was a game that was being developed in the late 90s by Running with Scissors, who are best known for the Postal series. The game would have focused on a cop named Angus, who is known for being sleazy. One day, he would wake up seeing an amoeba-like alien attached to his leg. He would also find out that his city has been engulfed by an alien bioship called the Nuloid. Instead of worrying about the town, Angus would discover that he could control the alien on his leg, as he decides to play around with his newfound powers and special abilities. However, the publisher for Running with Scissors, Ripcord Games, will see their parent company, Panasonic Interactive Media, close down. This would cause Ripcord to become independent. Running with Scissors would develop Flesh and Wire independently and get along with the new Ripcord team, even pledging to put $1.5 million into the project. However, Ripcord would ultimately pull out the project, and without a publisher, Flesh and Wire would ultimately be cancelled. Shortly after the game's cancellation, Running with Scissors would primarily focus on the Postal series, as Ripcord's license for Postal ended. This would result in the release of Postal 2, which became their most popular game. World of Darkness Online. World of Darkness was an online game that was being developed in 2006 by an Icelandic studio called CCP Games, after their merger with White Wolf Publishing. The game was going to be an MMORPG based on the 1991 board game of the same name. Like the board game, World of Darkness Online will give players the chance to join one of 7 vampire clans, with each clan having a unique ability from one another. While there would have been some combat in the game, the main focus would be on politics and making alliances, as players would try to gain influence to get votes to become a vampire prince or become a leader of a capital city. There would also be special zones where players can either interact or fight to settle their differences. Characters could also permanently die, killing all the progress players made with them. There would also be a unique building system in the game, where players would use tools to create items. Originally, World of Darkness would have a smooth development process, as CCP announced the game shortly after the White Wolf merger. They estimated that the game would take around 4 or 5 years to complete. In 2010, CCP would show off their game by releasing a trailer and concept art, saying that they plan to release the game by 2012. However, in 2011, CCP would fire 20% of their staff, which caused their resources to stretch thin, as CCP was also working on their popular MMO, EVE Online. Work for World of Darkness would continue, but with a much smaller group that fluctuated around 50 to 70 people. In 2014, CCP will state that the game was still years away, and they decided to cancel the project shortly after. The remaining staff working on World of Darkness would either get laid off or be transferred to work on EVE Online. Many of the staff would describe the development process as chaotic, since they would have to go back and forth with either working on World of Darkness or EVE Online. In 2015, CCP would sell the World of Darkness IP to Paradox Interactive, which would use assets of the World of Darkness online game in future projects. The Ripper. The Ripper was a game that was being developed for the PS3 and Xbox 360 by Visceral Games in 2009, with EA being the publisher. The game would have been a reimagining of the classic Jack the Ripper mystery. However, instead of killing prostitutes, he'd be battling and killing demons in the streets of London. Besides the game's plot, not much else is known about the Ripper, as EA would quickly cancel the project. In 2011 and 2012, some artists from Visceral Games would post artwork of the game to their website, giving people a clear view of what the game would have been like. Mario Takes America. Mario Takes America was an educational game that was pitched for the Philips CDI system. The game idea was pitched by the Canadian studio Sigma. Philip was so impressed by the game that they even decided to fund the project. As for the game itself, it would have focused on Mario traveling throughout the US on different vehicles, as he tries to get to Hollywood to star in a feature film. For the game's sake, I hope the movie is the 2023 Mario movie instead of the 1993 one. Anyway, the game was going to use full motion video footage shot from cars, helicopters, and speedboats. It would also use 2D animation and sprites, resembling the Super Mario Bros. Super Show. In case the developers couldn't get the rights to use Mario, they made backup plans, which include the original characters of a rock and roll star named Metal and his roadie sidekick named Heavy. They also had another plan to replace Mario with Sonic the Hedgehog, which was produced even though Sega never gave Sigma permission. In 1994, major problems would arise, as the full motion video would put a major strain on the CDI's limits. This would cause Philips to become unimpressed with the game, and they decided to ultimately pull their funding, causing Sigma to cancel the game and also go bankrupt shortly after. Like with Super Mario's Wacky Worlds, it's probably a good thing that Mario Takes America was cancelled, since it would have stained Mario's legacy. Besides, there are already educational Mario games, like Mario's Time Machine and Mario is Missing, which are considered some of the worst games in the series. Project Hammer. Project Hammer was a game that was being developed by Nintendo Software Technology, or NST for short. They're best known for developing the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series, as well as Wave Racer Blue Storm. Project Hammer was intended for the Wii, however, development for the game would begin in 2003, 3 years before the system was released. Unlike other Nintendo games, Project Hammer was intended for the hardcore Western market, as it would have been brutal and gritty. The game would officially be announced at 2006's Electronic Entertainment Expo. However, the development would be paused due to the late stages of development. There would be problems, as Project Hammer's gameplay didn't respond well to the Wii's remote's motion controls. But the biggest issue would be NST's relationship with Nintendo's Japanese executives. As one of the executives, Katsuhiko Kano, did not want to hear NST's input on the game, since they weren't Japanese. This resulted in NST accusing Nintendo of racism and strained relationships between the two. which would ultimately result in Kano being replaced with Pikmin director Masamichi Abe. Project Hammer would also be rebranded to Re-Crush, which had similar gameplay, but would have been more cuter and kid-friendly. Around that same time, Project Hammer's lead designer was also fired, with developers claiming the Japanese executives used him as a scapegoat, and refused to take any responsibility for the game failing. All of this would result in many developers at NST leaving in droves. It got so bad that Nintendo of America had to perform an internal review at NST, with them deciding that it was ultimately best to cancel Project Hammer. Ever since the game has been cancelled, NST has been severely demoted, as they only work on smaller games and projects now. During the Nintendo GigaLeaks, it was revealed that Project Hammer's gameplay would have been inspired by the Dynasty Warriors series. To be honest, I feel bad for NST, since they worked 6 years on a game they were passionate about, only to have it get cancelled by executives who didn't like it and get a demotion in return. Diablo Game Boy. Similar to my comments on Doom and StarCraft, Diablo is another 90s game that would be influential to PC gaming. Like StarCraft, Diablo was another early OST game that was developed by Blizzard. However, Diablo stood out by blending real-time strategy with RPG gameplay, as well as its dark gothic setting and its randomly generated dungeons, making it a very important series for Blizzard that is still popular today. Shortly after the release of Diablo 2, developer Jonathan Morin had an interesting idea. He wanted to create a port of Diablo for the Game Boy and call it Diablo Jr. Morin wanted Diablo Jr. to resemble the Pokemon series, as Pokemon was an international sensation at the time. This would have been accomplished by reworking Diablo's battle sequences to more resemble Pokemon, as well as targeting the game towards a younger audience. Development for the game would start around 2002, with Morin, as well as a team of 3 or 4 people working on the project. They decided to work on a Game Boy version first, so they could get used to working with cartridges. The final plan was to release the game on either the Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance, and have a system that was similar to Pokemon, where 2 different versions of the game would be made, with each version having a different character class, items, and starting town. After the resignation of Blizzard North founders David Brevik, Max Schaefer, and Eric Schaefer, Blizzard itself decided to take a look at the Diablo Jr. project and would ultimately decide to cancel it. Many factors were going to the game's cancellation, including the production cost of cartridges, lack of internet connections, Blizzard's focus on only working and supporting a few games to increase profits, not wanting to work with Nintendo, and Blizzard's ultimate focus on PC gaming. A prototype version of Diablo on the Game Boy would be released online, and it remains one of the more weird and unique experiments in Blizzard's history. Perfect Dark. The last entries on this list refers to games that were cancelled very recently, with this entry in particular being one of the bigger cancelled games in recent history, which was the planned Perfect Dark reboot. If you aren't familiar with the series, Perfect Dark was originally an N64 game developed by Rare. The game would focus on the character and Institute agent, Joanna Dark, as she's trying to stop an extraterrestrial conspiracy by the rival corporation Datadyne. The game would end up being a success for Rare and Nintendo, as it's in the top 20 best-selling games for the N64, with it being compared to another Rare title, GoldenEye 007. In fact, the game was so successful that Nintendo and Rare planned to continue the series, with a new game being teased for the GameCube. However, after Microsoft bought Rare in 2002, plans would ultimately change. Rare would develop a prequel to Perfect Dark titled Perfect Dark Zero, which would end up being a launch title for Microsoft's Xbox 360 in 2005. A year later, Rare planned to release 2 sequel games for the original Perfect Dark, titled Core and Vengeance. Both games would have been connected, as they'd focus on Dark traveling to places like Cairo and Russia, before eventually going to Saturn's largest moon, Titan, where she discovers an ancient civilization beneath its surface. However, Microsoft would cancel both games a year later, as Perfect Dark Zero underperformed their expectations, if they want to focus more on Halo and Gears of War instead. Besides a remaster of the N64 game in 2010, there haven't been any new additions to the series. There have been mentions of a new game throughout the years, like Rare stating they were considering a Perfect Dark game that would use the Kinect sensors, as well as Microsoft Studios director Kevin Loeb saying that a new game would eventually be developed. Finally, in 2020, at the Video Game Awards, it was announced that a Perfect Dark reboot was being developed by the initiative in Crystal Dynamics. However, many issues would come up in development due to the project constantly getting restarted and people always arriving and leaving in the development process. Finally, in 2025, Microsoft would shut down the initiative and cancel the Perfect Dark reboot as part of their massive 9,000 employee layoff this year, making the future of the Perfect Dark series very bleak. Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman is one of the most recognizable superheroes not only in DC, but in all of comics, being recognized as a standout member of the Justice League and someone that a lot of women look up to. Due to all of these factors, and the fact that the 2017 Wonder Woman movie did great in the box office, Warner Bros. Decided to greenlight a Wonder Woman video game in 2021, a first for the superhero. The game would have been developed by Monolith Games, who are best known for the Middle-earth series. Like those games, Wonder Woman would have used the Nemesis system, which is basically a rival system that can upgrade an NPC enemy if they defeat or form a strong rivalry with the player. The game's development would encounter problems, however, as lead developers would leave, and Monolith had problems implementing the Nemesis system in the game. Finally, in February of this year, Warner Bros. Would cancel the game, as well as shut down Monolith Studios due to budget cuts. Warner also wanted to concentrate on core franchises like Harry Potter, Mortal Kombat, DC, and Game of Thrones. While I highly doubt Wonder Woman will be excluded from any future DC projects due to her importance in the Justice League and overall importance in the universe, it's still unknown if she'll ever get her own standalone game. Black Panther. Finally, for our last entry, we have another superhero game, this time being Black Panther, who has gained popularity in recent years due to its highly successful film in 2018, which became a huge influence for the black community. Due to these factors, EA, in partnership with Marvel, would decide to announce a Black Panther game in 2023, along with the formation of Cliffhanger Games, who would develop the game. As for the game itself, it would have been very similar to the Wonder Woman game, as they both would be open world and would have also used the Nemesis system, as you would explore the world of Wakanda. However, EA will ultimately decide to cancel the game earlier this year, as well as close down Cliffhanger Games. EA's reasoning for cancelling the game is also similar to Warner Bros. In the last entry, as they want to focus on other titles like The Sims, Battlefield, Skate, and Apex Legends. Despite Black Panther being cancelled, EA and Marvel are still committed to their partnership, as they are working on releasing the Iron Man game being developed by Motive Studios. Like in the last entry, Black Panther will still most likely appear in Avengers and Marvel-themed games, but it's unknown if Black Panther will get a standalone game in the near future. Finally, we have reached the end of cancelled video games Iceberg. I'll keep a conclusion short, since this video has been a long and interesting journey. A lot of the games that were on this list had really interesting development stories and reasons for cancellations, from financial issues and cuts to internal politics and poor leadership. These games also ranged in quality too, as some of them could have been major hits and be regarded as being revolutionary for the gaming industry, while others would have been regarded as very bad in quality, and other games being somewhere in between. However, one thing all of these games have in common is that people spent years, sometimes even a decade, working on them, and it's a sad thing when something that you have put your heart and soul working on has suddenly been cancelled. That's of course not mentioning the fans' disappointment, with a game that they've been looking forward to playing has sadly been cancelled. But to end on a positive note, just because a game got cancelled doesn't mean it can be revived in the future. Many games on this list, like Star Fox 2, Metroid Dread, and Airworld, would finally see a public release after nearly 10 plus years of waiting, so there is still a possibility that some of these games do get revived in the future in one form or another. Even if most of these games never get revived, it's still nice to see early gameplay footage and even snapshots of the games, as it still shows and acknowledges the developer's work. Like I said in my introduction, I wasn't able to talk about every cancelled game, since there are hundreds of games that have been cancelled throughout the years. However, if you think there is a specific game I missed, let me know in the comments, and I might make a follow-up video in the future. Anyway, with that out of the way, I can finally talk about Mario Kart World, so until next time, Koopa... Wait, what did you say? Oh, okay, I understand. So it came to my attention that I have some unfinished business to take care of before I talk about Mario Kart World. I'll let you guess as to what that is, but Koopa's appearance should give you a hint. Anyway, with that being said, Koopa out.